September 19th, 1944. The fields outside Arracourt, France, burned gold under the late summer sun. Wheat stubble crunched beneath tank tracks, and the air tasted of diesel smoke and distant thunder. Major Hans von Schroeff sat motionless in his Panther's turret, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching something that would shatter everything he believed about armored warfare. Through the shimmer of heat rising from the valley, 5 American Sherman tanks advanced in a shallow wedge formation. They moved with deliberate coordination, their hulls low against the ridgeline, turrets traversing in synchronized sweeps. Behind von Schroeff, stretched across 3 kilometers of countryside, sat 12 Panthers from 5th Panzer Army, engines idling, crews confident. They were the Reich's finest steel predators, armed with the feared 75mm gun that could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 meters. The Americans shouldn't have stood a chance. Von Schroeff lowered his binoculars and glanced at his gunner, a pale-faced veteran from the Eastern Front named Steiner. 5 against 12, the major said quietly. They're either mad, or they know something we don't. Steiner chambered around, the metallic clack echoing inside the turret. Shermans burn easy, Herr Major. They always have. But von Schroeff felt something crawling beneath his confidence, a whisper of unease he couldn't name. He had commanded panzers since France in 1940, had rolled through Poland and deep into Russia. He knew the mathematics of armor, the geometry of killing fields. Yet something about this moment felt wrong. The Americans weren't charging, they weren't retreating, they were waiting. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The first shot came not from the Panthers, but from the Americans. A single Sherman fired, from hull-down position behind a stone wall. The shell streaked across the valley and struck the lead Panther just below its turret ring. Sparks erupted. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its hatches. Before von Schroeff could react, 2 more Shermans fired in rapid succession. Both rounds found their marks. 2 more Panthers exploded, their ammunition cooking off in brilliant orange fireballs. Von Schroeff's mouth went dry. 3 tanks destroyed in under 10 seconds. The American crews weren't simply shooting, they were executing a drill, precise and rehearsed. His radio crackled with confusion and panic. German commanders shouted orders, contradicting each other. One Panther surged forward alone, its commander believing aggression would scatter the enemy. It lasted 30 meters before a Sherman's 76mm shell tore through its side armor. The German tank rolled to a stop, flames licking from its engine compartment. Herr Major, orders? Steiner's voice was, tight with fear. Von Schroeff watched through his optics as the remaining Shermans shifted position, moving not as individual machines but as a single organism. One tank provided covering fire, while the others maneuvered. Their turrets never stopped moving, scanning, tracking, communicating through what he would later learn was radio coordination far superior to anything the Wehrmacht possessed. Another Panther tried to flank left, its commander attempting the classic pincer movement that had worked so well in Russia. But the Americans had anticipated it. A Sherman was already waiting, hull concealed behind a farmhouse. It fired once. The Panther's track exploded in a shower of steel links. Immobilized, the German crew bailed out as a second shell punched through the turret, turning the interior into an inferno. 6 Panthers destroyed. The Americans hadn't lost a single tank. Von Schroeff's hands trembled on the hatch rim. Around him, the surviving Panther commanders were beginning to understand what he already knew. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Shermans advanced again, their formation tightening. Smoke grenades popped, white clouds drifting across the battlefield, obscuring their movement. When the smoke cleared, they had closed the distance by 200 meters, and von Schroeff could see their commanders standing in open hatches, directing fire with hand signals. "They're not afraid of us," he whispered. Steiner looked at him, confused. "What?" "They're not afraid," von Schroeff repeated louder. "They've done this before. Many times. His radio erupted with another transmission. A Panther on the right flank reported engine failure, its crew abandoning the vehicle before it could be targeted. Another commander screamed that his gunner had been killed by a direct hit to the cupola. The American fire wasn't random. It was surgical, aimed at weak points, delivered with a speed that suggested crews who had trained together until shooting became instinct. Von Schroeff watched a Sherman fire on the move, its gun stabilized in a way German tanks could never match. The shell hit a Panther's turret face, penetrating the armor that was supposed to be impervious. The German tank's turret lifted slightly from the blast, then settled at an angle, smoke billowing from every opening. 7 destroyed. The major's mind raced through the doctrine he'd been taught at the Panzer school in Wunsdorf: superior armor, superior guns, aggressive maneuver, but none of it accounted for this. The Americans weren't trying to match German technology. They had built something different entirely. Crews that fought as teams, tanks that could hit targets while moving, radios in every vehicle allowing instant coordination. An 8th Panther exploded, hit from a direction von Schroeff hadn't even seen the Sherman approach from. His own crew was silent now, watching the slaughter unfold. The gunner's hands hovered over his controls, but there was nothing to shoot at. Every time a Panther exposed itself to engage, the Americans destroyed it before it could fire. "Terre Major." His driver's voice crackled through the intercom. "We should withdraw." Von Schroeff said nothing. He was transfixed by what he was witnessing. This wasn't just tactical superiority. It was a fundamental reimagining of armored combat. The Americans had taken their supposedly inferior Shermans and transformed them through training, coordination, and doctrine into weapons that turned German superiority into a liability. A 9th Panther tried to reverse behind cover, but it was too late. 2 Shermans fired simultaneously, their shells converging on the German tank from different angles. It erupted in flames, the crew's escape hatch blown skyward by the internal explosion. Von Schroeff counted the remaining Panthers, 3 left, including his own, against 5 Shermans that hadn't suffered a scratch. The American formation pivoted smoothly, their movements so coordinated, they might have been connected by invisible strings. 1 Sherman laid down, suppressing fire while the others advanced. Another popped smoke to cover their approach. A 3rd moved to flank. It was textbook combined arms tactics, executed with a precision that made von Schroeff's stomach turn. "Fall back," he said quietly into his radio. "All units, disengage and withdraw to secondary positions." The response was immediate relief, mixed with shame. The surviving Panthers began reversing, their commanders desperate to escape the killing field. But the Americans weren't finished. As the Germans retreated, 1 Sherman surged forward, its commander apparently deciding that pursuit was warranted. It closed to within 500 meters of von Schroeff's Panther before he finally gave the order. "Steiner, target that Sherman. Fire when ready." The 75mm gun roared. The shell struck the Sherman's upper glacis, but deflected off the sloped armor, leaving only a black scar. Before Steiner could reload, the American tank fired back. The round missed by meters, but the message was clear. Even in retreat, the Germans weren't safe. Von Schroeff's Panther lurched backward, tracks churning the soft French soil. Around him, the battlefield was littered with burning German armor. 12 Panthers reduced to smoking wrecks. 12 crews, some of the finest Panzer men in the Wehrmacht, dead or captured. And the Americans had accomplished it with 5 medium tanks that German propaganda had dismissed as inferior. As his tank crested a hill and began its retreat toward the tree line, von Schroeff turned for one last look at the valley. The 5 Shermans sat in a loose formation, their crews already dismounting to assess damage and reload ammunition. They moved with casual confidence, soldiers who knew they had just won decisively and would win again tomorrow. The major slumped in his cupola, exhaustion and disbelief washing over him. His gunner's earlier words echoed in his mind. Shermans burn easy. They always have. But today, it had been Panthers burning, not Shermans. Today, quality had been crushed by something more powerful than thick armour or long guns. It had been crushed by competence. The Battle of Arracourt wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. In the autumn of 1944, the German High Command believed they still possessed one decisive advantage over the Allies: superior armour. The Panther tank, officially designated Panzer Kampfwagen 5, was a technological marvel. Its sloped frontal armour could deflect most Allied shells. Its 75mm gun could penetrate enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was impossible. On paper, it was the perfect weapon. But wars aren't fought on paper. They're fought in mud and smoke by exhausted men who must make split-second decisions while shells explode around them. And in September 1944, those men were about to learn a brutal lesson about the difference between engineering excellence and combat effectiveness. Major Hans von Schroeff had joined the Wehrmacht in 1936, drawn by the promise of Germany's armoured renaissance. He had studied under Heinz Guderian's disciples, absorbed the principles of blitzkrieg, learned to think of tanks not as infantry support, but as the tip of a lightning spear. By 1940, he was commanding a platoon in France, watching panzers slice through defences that had held for years in the previous war. The early victories had seemed to prove everything the theorists promised. Speed, shock, and superior technology could overwhelm any defence. But then came Russia, and with it, the first doubts. The 34 had shaken German confidence. It was crude, uncomfortable, prone to breaking down. Yet it kept coming, wave after wave, built in factories that somehow continued producing even as the Wehrmacht drove deeper into Soviet territory. The Panther had been Germany's answer, designed to match the formation, 34's sloped armour, while maintaining German engineering precision. When von Schroeff first saw one in early 1943, he had felt relief. Finally, a tank that could restore German superiority. He watched test crews punch holes through captured Soviet armour at ranges that seemed impossible. The Panther's optical sights were so precise that gunners joked they could count rivets on enemy tanks before destroying them. But precision required time. Each Panther took thousands of man-hours to produce. The engine, a magnificent Maybach that produced 700 horsepower, demanded constant maintenance. The transmission, over-engineered to handle the tank's 45-ton weight, failed with disturbing regularity. Von Schroeff learned to curse the machine even as he admired it. The Panther was a thoroughbred that required constant care in an arena that rewarded workhorses. By the summer of 1944, after the Normandy invasion, German panzer divisions found themselves stretched desperately thin. Each loss hurt not just tactically, but strategically. A destroyed Panther couldn't be easily replaced. The factories that built them were under constant bombardment. The skilled workers who assembled them were being drafted into infantry units to plug gaps in the line. Every tank that burned represented months of labour that couldn't be recovered. The Americans, von Schroeff had heard, faced no such constraints. Their Sherman production lines ran day and night. When a Sherman was destroyed, 3 more arrived the next week. German intelligence officers dismissed this as quantity over quality, crude mass production that any competent panzer crew could handle. Von Schroeff had wanted to believe that. He needed to believe it. But belief wasn't strategy. And by September 19th, as his unit moved to counterattack American forces near Arracourt, von Schroeff carried doubts he wouldn't voice to his men. He had seen too many supposedly inferior Soviet tanks win through sheer numbers and determination. He had watched 34s absorb punishment that should have destroyed them, only to keep fighting. And he had begun to suspect that German doctrine, for all its elegance, had a fatal flaw. It assumed the enemy would cooperate by fighting the way Germany wanted to fight. The Americans, he would soon discover, had no intention of cooperating. On the morning of the 19th, von Schroeff's battalion received orders to advance through the Paroy forest and seize the town of Arracourt. Intelligence reported light American resistance, mostly infantry, with minimal armor support. The operation was supposed to be a demonstration of German armored power, a reminder that the Wehrmacht could still strike effectively, despite being pushed back toward the Rhine. What intelligence hadn't reported was that the American 4th Armored Division had been preparing for exactly this kind of counterattack. Their commander, Major General John Wood, was a disciple of aggressive armored warfare who believed in using terrain, coordination, and speed to offset the Shermans' technical disadvantages. His units had been training together since before D-Day, running drill after drill until every crew knew instinctively how their neighbours would react. The Germans, by contrast, had been cobbled together from the survivors of multiple shattered divisions. Some crews had combat experience, others were fresh from training schools, boys barely old enough to shave who had been rushed to the front to replace casualties. They all sat in excellent tanks, but they had never fought together as a cohesive unit. As von Schroeff's Panthers emerged from the forest into the open farmland beyond, he felt the old confidence returning. The sight of 12 Panthers moving in formation was still imposing. Their engines rumbled with power, their guns elevated smoothly, tracking potential targets. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that German superiority would assert itself once more. Then he saw the Shermans, and everything changed. They weren't hiding. They weren't retreating. They were positioned in overwatch, hull down behind terrain features, their commanders visible in open hatches. 5 tanks against 12. It should have been suicide. Instead, it looked like a trap, and von Schroeff realized with sickening certainty that he had just led his battalion into it. The Americans fired first, not with the panic of outgunned troops, but with the calm precision of marksmen at target practice. Von Schroeff watched his lead Panther erupt in flames before his gunner could even identify a target. 2 more Panthers died in the opening salvo, their crews still trying to understand what was happening. That was when Major von Schroeff understood the terrible truth. The Americans didn't need to match German armor quality. They had built something more dangerous, competence multiplied by coordination. Every Sherman crew knew exactly where their neighboring tanks were positioned. They communicated constantly via radio, something German doctrine had never emphasized. When one Sherman fired, the others adjusted their aim based on that shot's result. They covered each other's reloads, alternating fire to maintain constant pressure. The Panthers, despite their superior guns and armor, fought as individuals. Each commander made his own decisions, tried his own maneuvers, died alone when American shells found the gaps in their armor. Von Schroeff shouted orders into his radio, trying to coordinate a response, but his transmissions were drowned out by panicked reports and contradictory commands from other officers. Within minutes, the mathematical advantage had reversed. 5 coordinated Shermans fighting as a single unit had become more deadly than 12 superior Panthers operating independently. It was a lesson the Red Army had learned at terrible cost in 1941 and 42. Now the Wehrmacht was learning it, and the tuition was measured in burning crews and shattered metal. Von Schroeff's decision to retreat wasn't cowardice, it was mathematics. He could see the pattern now, could predict how each Panther that tried to engage would be isolated and destroyed. Staying meant sacrificing his remaining tanks for no tactical gain. Retreating meant preserving something that might fight another day. But as his Panther reversed away from the killing field, von Schroeff knew he was retreating from more than just American tanks. He was retreating from a future where German technical superiority no longer mattered, where the carefully crafted myths of Panzer invincibility had been reduced to smoke drifting across a French valley. Behind him, 12 Panthers burned. Ahead of him, the road back to Germany stretched long and bitter. And in his mind, those 5 Shermans sat motionless, their crews calm and confident, waiting for the next wave of German armor that would come believing it was superior, right up until the moment it started burning. The retreat to the forest line took 20 minutes, that felt like hours. Von Schroeff's surviving Panthers crawled backward, their commanders twisted in their cupolas, watching for pursuing Americans who never came. The Shermans had accomplished their mission and saw no need to press their advantage into unknown terrain. They held the field, and that was enough. When von Schroeff's Panther finally reached cover beneath the dense canopy of oak and pine, he ordered his driver to halt. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, something he rarely did inside the tank. The smoke filled the turret, acrid and harsh, but it gave him something to focus on besides the images replaying in his mind. 12 Panthers, 5 Shermans. Mathematics that shouldn't have worked, but did. His radio crackled. Herr Major, Battalion Command is requesting status report. Von Schroeff stared at the transmitter for a long moment before responding. What could he say? That they had been outfought by tanks they'd been taught to despise? That American crew training had proven more valuable than German engineering? That everything the propaganda ministry said about Allied inferiority was a comforting lie? Tell them we encountered overwhelming enemy armor, he said finally. Estimate 20 to 30 American tanks. We inflicted casualties but were forced to withdraw to avoid encirclement. It was a lie, but a necessary one. The truth, that 5 Shermans had massacred 12 Panthers through superior tactics alone, would be dismissed as defeatist propaganda. No one wanted to hear that the war was already lost. His gunner, Steiner, removed his headset and wiped sweat from his face. Herr Major, those Shermans, they fought like they'd done it 100 times before. Von Schroeff nodded slowly. They probably have. While we've been rushing crews through abbreviated training and throwing them into combat, the Americans have been drilling their units until coordination becomes reflex. He thought about the American tank commanders he'd seen standing in their hatches, directing fire with calm hand signals. They hadn't been protected by armor, yet they'd stayed exposed to maintain situational awareness and communication with their crews. German doctrine emphasized buttoning up, staying protected. But protection meant isolation, and isolation meant dying alone when the Americans exploited that weakness. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Other surviving Panthers began arriving, their crews shaken and silent. Von Schroeff counted them. 3. Out of 12. A 75% loss rate in less than an hour of combat. The kind of casualties that destroyed divisions, ended careers, broke armies. One of the arriving commanders, a young lieutenant named Braun, who had graduated from Panzer school just 3 months earlier, climbed down from his tank and walked toward von Schroeff. His face was pale, eyes too wide. Herr Major, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I don't understand. We had superior positioning, superior weapons. How did they? He trailed off, unable to finish the question. Von Schroeff took a long drag from his cigarette. They were better than us, he said simply. Not better tanks, better crews. Braun looked as if he'd been slapped. The admission violated everything they'd been taught, every assumption that had sustained them through years of war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That evening, as darkness settled over the forest, von Schroeff sat on his Panther's fender and tried to write his after-action report. The words came slowly, each sentence an indictment of everything he'd believed. He described the American fire coordination, their use of terrain, the way they'd anticipated every German maneuver. He recommended immediate changes to German tactics, emphasizing radio discipline and combined arms coordination. He knew the report would be filed and forgotten. The Wehrmacht no longer had time to retrain its forces or redesign its doctrine. They were bleeding divisions faster than they could replace them, losing ground measured in kilometers per day rather than the great sweeping advances of 1940. What had happened at Arracourt was merely a symptom of a larger disease, the erosion of German military competence through years of attrition. Steiner brought him a mess tin of lukewarm soup and sat down beside him. They ate in silence, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. The American advance continued, inexorable as a tide. "Do you think we'll be ordered to counterattack again?" Steiner asked. Von Schroeff shook his head. "Not us. They'll find fresh crews who still believe Panthers are invincible. We'll be held in reserve, at least until our casualties can be replaced." But both men knew there were no replacements coming. The factories couldn't keep pace with losses. The training schools couldn't produce competent crews fast enough. And even if they could, there wasn't enough fuel to move the tanks or ammunition to feed their guns. The logistics that had sustained German victories in the early war years had collapsed under the weight of fighting on multiple fronts against enemies whose industrial capacity dwarfed the Reich's. As night deepened, von Schroeff found himself thinking about the Sherman crews. They would be celebrating now, he imagined, recounting the battle over cigarettes and coffee. They would write letters home describing their victory, modest accounts that understated their own role while praising their comrades. And tomorrow they would climb back into their tanks and do it again, because they had enough tanks, enough fuel, enough ammunition, enough training to sustain operations indefinitely. The Americans had solved war through multiplication. They had taken adequate machines and multiplied them by superior training, better coordination, and overwhelming logistics. The Germans had tried to solve war through perfection, building magnificent machines that required perfect conditions to function. In the chaos of actual combat, perfection proved fragile while adequacy endured. Von Schroeff stubbed out his cigarette and climbed back into his Panther's turret. Sleep wouldn't come easily, not with the images of burning tanks still fresh in his mind. But eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed trauma, and he dozed in his commander's seat, dreaming of a world where engineering excellence still mattered more than industrial capacity. He woke before dawn to the sound of American artillery, distant but growing closer. The war was coming for them again, patient and methodical, carried forward by men in adequate tanks who understood that wars weren't won by individual acts of heroism, but by systematic application of coordinated force. The Battle of Arracourt continued for another week, though von Schroeff's battalion saw little of it. They remained in reserve, their depleted ranks too valuable to waste in futile counterattacks. From the forest positions, they could hear the fighting, the constant thunder of guns that never seemed to cease. American artillery had a rhythm to it, systematic and relentless, unlike the sporadic barrages of German guns that fired until their ammunition ran out and then fell silent. Reports filtered back through battalion command, each one worse than the last. German Panzer units were being systematically destroyed by American armor that fought with textbook precision. The pattern von Schroeff had witnessed was repeating across the entire sector. American tank destroyers worked in coordination with Shermans, fixing German positions while artillery pounded them. When Panthers advanced to engage, they found themselves outmaneuvered by tanks that shouldn't have been able to match them. One report caught von Schroeff's attention. A Panther company commander described watching American tanks use smoke grenades to screen their movements while shifting positions. "They disappeared and reappeared like ghosts," the report stated. "By the time we acquired new firing solutions, they had already engaged us from different angles." It was combined arms warfare executed with a sophistication that German forces had once monopolized, but could no longer sustain. Lieutenant Braun approached von Schroeff's tank one afternoon, carrying a battered American field manual he'd recovered from a destroyed Sherman. "Herr Major, you should see this." Von Schroeff took the manual and flipped through pages marked with mud and blood. It was a tactical doctrine document, densely written but remarkably practical. It outlined exactly the techniques he'd witnessed: coordinated fire and movement, exploitation of terrain, radio discipline, mutual support. What struck him most was the manual's assumption that Sherman crews would face superior German armor. It didn't pretend the Sherman was a better tank. Instead, it taught crews how to use their advantages: speed, reliability, numbers, coordination, to negate German technical superiority. It was a document written by realists who understood their limitations and had developed doctrine to overcome them. They've thought this through, Braun said quietly. Every scenario, every contingency. While we were being told German armor was invincible, they were training to defeat it. Von Schroeff closed the manual and handed it back. Make copies if you can. Distribute them to the other commanders. Maybe we can learn something before it's too late. But it was already too late. By September 25th, German forces around Arracourt had lost more than 80 tanks and assault guns. American losses were minimal, fewer than 20 tanks destroyed. The mathematics was devastating. At this exchange rate, the Americans could sustain operations indefinitely while German Panzer strength evaporated. Von Schroeff received orders to withdraw on the 28th. His battalion, reduced to 3 operational Panthers and a handful of supporting vehicles, retreated eastward toward the German frontier. The roads were clogged with refugees and defeated soldiers, all moving in the same direction, away from the Americans who advanced with methodical certainty. As his Panther rolled through a destroyed village, von Schroeff saw German propaganda posters still clinging to walls. They showed mighty tigers crushing enemy tanks, heroic crews grinning beneath iron crosses. The images felt like artifacts from another war, a conflict where mythology still mattered. The real war, the one he'd just lost, was about logistics, training, and industrial capacity, all things Germany no longer possessed in adequate supply. They crossed into Germany on October 2nd. The border meant nothing militarily, just another line on a map that wouldn't stop American tanks. But psychologically, it marked a threshold. Von Schroeff had spent 4 years fighting across Europe, always advancing, or at worst holding ground. Now he was retreating into the fatherland itself, pursued by an enemy whose superiority grew with each passing day. His battalion was disbanded a week later, its surviving Panthers distributed to other units desperate for armor. Von Schroeff received orders to report to a training facility where he would help prepare the next generation of Panzer crews. It felt like a cruel joke. What could he teach them? How to lose with dignity. How to die in superior tanks against inferior ones operated by better-trained crews. On his last evening with the battalion, von Schroeff gathered his crew around their Panther. They had survived Arracourt together, witnessed the end of German armoured superiority together. Now they would scatter to different units, different fates. "I want you to remember what we saw," he told them. "Not so you can blame yourselves, but so you understand. We lost not because we lacked courage or skill. We lost because the Americans built a better system." Steiner, who had served with him since France, nodded slowly. "Will that make any difference, Herr Major? To the next cruise? The next battles?" Von Schroeff looked at their Panther, its armor scarred but intact, its guns still capable of destroying any tank on the battlefield. "Probably not," he admitted, "but at least we'll die knowing the truth." The training facility where von Schroeff reported was located near Paderborn, safely distant from the fighting but close enough to hear occasional air raid sirens. The students were teenagers, most of them 16 or 17, rushed through abbreviated courses that focused on gunnery and basic tactics. They sat in classrooms decorated with the same propaganda posters von Schroeff had seen in France, images of invincible panzers and heroic crews. On his first day, von Schroeff was asked to brief the students on combat experiences. He stood before 80 young faces and tried to find words that would prepare them without crushing their spirits. "The American Sherman," he began, "is not the inferior tank you've been told it is." The room stirred. Instructors at the back exchanged uncomfortable glances. Von Schroeff continued, "It's adequately armoured, adequately armed, and mechanically reliable. But more importantly, Sherman crews are extensively trained and fight as coordinated units. They use terrain effectively. They communicate constantly via radio, and they have unlimited ammunition and fuel." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You will face 3 or 4 Shermans for every Panzer you crew. They will coordinate their fire. They will flank you while you're engaged with one tank, and when you destroy one, another will arrive the next day to replace it." A student raised his hand. But Herr Major, if our tanks are superior, how can we lose? Von Schroef looked at the boy, seeing himself 10 years earlier, full of confidence and ignorant of war's realities. Because war isn't about individual superiority, it's about systems. The Americans have built a system that produces competent crews in reliable tanks, supported by logistics that never fail. We've built individual masterpieces that require perfect conditions to function. The supervising colonel cleared his throat, a warning. Von Schroef was straying into dangerous territory, challenging official narratives, but he couldn't stop. These boys deserved truth, not comfortable lies. When you engage the enemy, he said, remember that your Panther's technical superiority matters less than your crew's coordination. Train with your gunner, your loader, your driver, until you function as one organism. Learn your radio procedures until communication becomes instinct, and never ever assume that because your tank is better, you will win. After the briefing, the colonel pulled him aside. Major von Schroef, your honesty is appreciated, but perhaps overly stark for students about to enter combat. Von Schroef met his gaze. With respect, Herr Colonel, these boys are going to die if we keep telling them myths. The Americans have already figured out how to kill Panthers. The least we can do is give our crews a chance. The colonel looked away. The war is already lost, isn't it? It wasn't really a question. Von Schroef said nothing, which was answer enough. Over the following weeks, von Schroef threw himself into training, determined to give his students every advantage his experience could provide. He taught them the American tactics he'd witnessed, the fire and movement patterns, the coordination techniques. He showed them the captured field manual, pointing out the systematic approach that made American crews so effective. Some students absorbed the lessons eagerly. Others clung to the myths of German superiority, unable to accept that their magnificent Panthers might not be enough. Von Schroef understood both reactions. Accepting German vulnerability required abandoning the narratives that had sustained them through years of war. It was easier to believe in technological supremacy than face the reality of systemic failure. In December, the training schedule was cut from 12 weeks to 6. The Wehrmacht needed crews immediately for the Ardennes offensive. Von Schroef watched his students graduate early, boys who should have spent another month learning their craft. They climbed into their Panthers with forced confidence, trying to hide their fear behind stern expressions. Lieutenant Braun, who had also been assigned to the training facility, found von Schroef watching the students depart. "They're not ready," Braun said quietly. Von Schroef shook his head. "No, but neither were we, and we survived Arracourt." "We were lucky." "Yes, let's hope they are too." News from the Ardennes came quickly. Initial successes, as German armor pushed through weak American defenses, breaking through lines that hadn't expected a major offensive. For 3 days, it seemed possible that the old magic might return, that German panzers could still shock and overwhelm. Then the weather cleared, Allied aircraft filled the skies, and the offensive ground to a halt. Von Schroef read the casualty reports with numb recognition. Panther and Tiger units destroyed by American artillery and airstrikes. Crews who had pushed deep into American lines found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. The pattern from Arracourt repeated at a larger scale. German technical superiority couldn't overcome American material abundance and coordination. One report mentioned his former students. Their battalion had been committed on the second day, tasked with exploiting a breakthrough that never materialized. They'd run into American armored reserves and been systematically destroyed in fighting that lasted less than 4 hours. Of the 15 Panthers that entered combat, 2 survived. Von Schroef read the names of the dead and felt nothing. He'd gone numb to loss months ago. By January 1945, the training facility received orders to prepare for evacuation. Allied forces were approaching from both east and west. There was talk of a final stand, of new wonder weapons that would turn the tide. Von Schroef ignored the rumours. He'd seen the future at Arracourt, watched it unfold with mathematical certainty. On his last day at the facility, he walked through the empty classrooms where he'd tried to teach truth to boys who deserved better than to die for myths. The propaganda posters still hung on walls, faded but defiant. Invincible Panzers, heroic crews, final victory. He thought about tearing them down but didn't. Let them remain as monuments to hubris. Outside, the sound of artillery rumbled in the distance. American guns, methodical and patient. Von Schreif climbed into a staff car for the journey east, toward Berlin and whatever end awaited there. As they drove through the winter landscape, he found himself thinking again about those 5 Shermans at Arracourt. They had been ordinary machines crewed by ordinary men who had become extraordinary through systematic training and doctrine. They didn't need to be perfect. They'd only needed to be competent and coordinated. And that had been enough to shatter the myth of German armoured invincibility. Von Schreif closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the images returned. 12 Panthers burning, 5 Shermans waiting calmly for the next target, the mathematical certainty of defeat written in smoke and fire across a French valley. He had retreated immediately because staying meant dying for nothing, but the retreat had never really ended. It stretched from Arracourt to Paderborn to wherever this road led, a long, slow withdrawal from the future into history's judgment. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.